On June 19th of 2018, Doug Ford was sworn in as the first newly elected MPP to take office as premier since Mitch Hepburn did in 1934. As of 2019, the Ford administration made changes to the funds allocated towards education, making monumental cuts to the public school systems and to the amount of financial aid students will receive for post-secondary education from the Ontario Student Assistance Program, or OSAP for short. This is where our story begins. In previous years, based on my household income, I would receive anywhere from $6,000 to $7,000 in loans for the year when no grant money. This year, with the new cuts, I only received $110 in loans per term. Tuition costs are trending upwards, and so is the cost of living. This drastic change in financial support threw a wrench in many people's plans because, not dissimilar from myself, a lot of students came into university expecting to receive a certain amount, and when that changed when they were partway through their degrees, this resulted in people dropping out, going to private institutions for loans, or drastic lifestyle changes. To see how these changes are affecting students and to determine the effect it has on individuals, I took to the streets of Queen's campus and the Kingston area to find out. These cuts have affected the entire culture around attending post-secondary education. While it may not always be a hot subject to speak on for people, the repercussions are felt throughout the province. On April 4th of 2019, over 100,000 students from over 700 high schools across Ontario staged a walkout from their classes in defiance against the Ford government. Ontario in particular has never seen anything like this. While tuition rates have been on the rise, and the new changes to OSAP have actually decreased the cost of tuition by 10%, this is the first time since OSAP's creation in 1966 that changes this drastic were made. To really look at how OSAP in its current state has developed to be where it is today, we'll have to look at the changes made to it starting in 2003. OSAP has gone through many changes throughout its presence in the Canadian education system. What I wanted to find out was how much of an impact does financial aid have on the success of the average student. In 2003, the first major changes were made. The Ontario Liberal Party was elected, and they committed to a 2-year tuition freeze, expanded the eligibility for loans, and waived tuition costs for the neediest 10%. By September 2004, the tuition freeze was implemented and major changes were on the way. In 2006, the tuition free was lifted and a 4-year framework was implemented with new changes to the tuition costs in Ontario, with the combined overall cap increasing by 5%. Ontario tuition rates were regulated by the Ministry of Training, Colleges, and Universities through the Tuition Fee Framework Guidelines. The next major changes were made in 2011 when the Liberals were re-elected. Prior to this election, there was a 6-month interest-free grace period on student loans, and limits for how much could be loaned was raised from $7,000 to $7,300. Following the election, the Liberal government introduced a platform that was made to support all middle-class Ontario families, with a 30% across-the-board undergraduate tuition grant. This means every year, families of 5 out of 6 students will save $1,600 per student in university and $730 per student in college. As of January 2012, the 30% off Ontario tuition grant was launched for dependent students in first entry programs. There was also a revised 4-year tuition framework announced in 2013 that would reduce the overall tuition cap from 5% to 3%. Kathleen Wynne and the Liberals were re-elected to a majority government in 2014, with its only post-secondary platform commitment being to continue the 30% off Ontario tuition grant. In the 2016 budget, the Ontario government announced an overhaul of student financial assistance in Ontario. This included eliminating tuition costs and post-secondary education tax credits and multiple OSAP grants, including the 30% off Ontario tuition grant, and merged them all into the Ontario Student Grant, which was designed to cover the cost of tuition for all families with a household income of $50,000 and would scale up for household incomes up to $160,000 receiving 30% off tuition costs. This resulted in the proportion for Ontario student assistance to be shifted in favor of non-repayable grants. Prior to this, grants made up 60% of financial assistance for education, with the remaining 40% being for loans. However, as of 2017 and 2018, grants made up 98% of student assistance, with only 2% being made up by loans. Now in 2019 is where our current story begins. The Progressive Conservative government was elected in June of 2018 and announced major changes to OSAP starting in January of 2019. This included a 10% tuition fee reduction for all students, followed by a freeze in 2019 and 2020. However, it also cut the budget for OSAP from $2 billion down to $1.4 billion. This resulted in major changes being made to OSAP, including updates to the loan-to-grant ratio students receive. Ancillary fees, meaning fees on top of tuition, being changed from mandatory to opt-outable, which causes many on-campus services to suffer. The grace period to repay loans has been removed, and the amount of money that students receive has been drastically changed. While all these changes result in drastic changes to the way students experience life on campus day to day, they have an even greater effect on the long-term repercussions of them and how the student body and on-campus services have to adjust to accommodate for the new changes in support systems.
Hi. My name is Aldo Barovier. I teach in York Region, and this is actually my 25th year of teaching.
Amazing. And how long have you been on strike?
Well, we've been on strike. This would be our sixth day, sixth out of the entire rotating strikes we've been going on. Well, we'd like fair funding for education, fair compensation in the form of a cost of living increase, and funding for special education, a guarantee that kindergarten teachers will remain in kindergarten, and that there's no e-learning without any studies or due diligence being done beforehand. I was around for the first round with Conservatives in the 1990s. 1997 felt different. Before that, it felt different as well because there truly was an economic downturn in the province. So back in the Bob Rae days when there was a percent cut across the board, all public sectors, that felt fair. This time around, we know this is not a matter of economics, but one of ideology. The Conservatives are looking to cut costs in education and healthcare, and this is just one of the portfolios that they're going after. They're hoping to undermine public confidence, to bring in charter schools and voucher schools, and they're doing it in a very underhanded way by, let's just say, deliberately misinforming the public about the facts and figures of the education budget, when different organizations independent of the government or the teacher unions have clearly shown that the grant for student needs has been lowered. And by masking this with including costs for daycare into the budget, it just shows how far this government's willing to go to achieve what they'd like to achieve. Well, we've already seen how it's being affected by the cuts to education. We've seen cuts already to special education. We're seeing cuts already to building repair. So we already have seen them. And I expect as we move forward, when the student ratios get increased, the cuts will have an even further severe impact on the learning conditions. That's a great question. Some people are already doing that. They're already contacting their MPPs. They're already coming to the lines, the picket lines to support teachers. Not a day has gone on this strike that we haven't had visits from family and from students, either joining us or just providing some support, thanking us for what we're doing. I think the campaign on media and social media has shown that there's a great deal of parent support. In fact, people who don't have any stake in the game have also been showing support. Normally, teacher unions and teachers don't seem to get the benefit of the doubt because of the summers off and so on. That's always a great target. But this time feels extremely different because you get comments preceded by, I've never supported teacher unions before, but I've never done this before, but I think the public understands what it means to have a kindergarten teacher in a classroom and to have face-to-face learning in high school. Those are issues they can all understand, regardless of the other fine print items.
Contrary to what you hear out there, it's not about money. Honestly, just looking for reasonable class sizes. Don't give us more kids. Don't take away our special education funding or special education teachers or support staff. And don't get rid of your kindergarten teachers. You kind of need us.
I think for the kids, obviously, they're the ones that are the most affected by all of this. For me personally, in kindergarten, I think the bigger class sizes, there's more special ed students in our regular classes, and there's not enough support for all of them. So all the kids are suffering because teachers and our support staff aren't able to give the right amount of support that they need in order for the kids to reach their full potential. The extracurriculars, obviously that's a big deal for the kids, and some of those kids, that's their outlet, and that's the last thing we want to take from them. But we're trying to prove all of these extra things that we do out of the kindness of our heart and on our own time, that take away from our planning time and take away from our own family time with our families.
Come out and talk to us. Come and get it from us. You watch the news and you listen to the other end. You're going to hear a different story, right? Come to the trenches, right? This is where it's really at. You're going to get the real deal from us, right?
You can also
MPs too. You're the one that put them into power, so they've got the power to make the changes. So contact them, email them, go to the office, knock on the door, call them.
Fair enough. We voted in a conservative government, so here we are dealing with the consequences of that.
One of the other things someone pointed out online is that many of the teachers today are the students that went through the strike 20 years ago. So I was in grade 7 then. My mom was a teacher then, and now we are the teachers.
Last time we were on strike or work to rule, there wasn't as much support from the community. This time around, I think, more parents and more students actually are aware that it's not about money, that it's about their well-being, and us wanting to have in the classroom what's going to help them be most successful. I actually see some of our kids right now from our school over there, which is awesome.
Well, we've missed a lot of days and we really want to learn some stuff. Some of our extra activities of school have been cut and we want them back. We want the strike to end and the teachers to win. I have been very upset that school has been canceled and I want to go back to school.
We want to have everything that we used to have back, and we want to make sure that our teachers and everyone get what they deserve and all the people who need it.
It's not right to make cuts. We want the kids at the school to be happy. If Doug Ford was right here right now, I would say strike is hurting kids and we want to go back to school.
Students who, like myself, were in the middle of their education when these cuts were made had to find alternative ways to make up the money that they were expecting to receive by either finding a part-time job, which can be to the detriment of their education, and some may even have to drop out. Luckily, there are alternative ways that students can pay for education. One is a local Canadian business called Higher Ed Points, which converts loyalty points into money for students for education. I sat down with Suzanne Tyson, the CEO of Higher Ed Points, and her daughter, Ashley Cowie, so they could tell me a little bit more about Higher Ed Points.
My name's Ashley Cowie. I'm a third-year film and media student at Queen's University, and my mom, Suzanne Tyson, runs a business called Higher Ed Points. Higher Ed Points is the first company in the entire world to convert loyalty points into money to pay for tuition or to repay student loans. I personally benefited from Higher Ed Points because my parents have used some of their loyalty points to pay for my tuition. They've paid about $3,000 in my tuition through converting loyalty points, and I personally know that I would not be the person who I am today if I didn't go to Queen's. It's shaped me so much as a person, from the extracurriculars to the classrooms to my passion for film and being able to study that here. I know that my time at Queen's has really shaped who I am, so I'm very, very grateful to have this educational experience.
I'm Suzanne Tyson. I'm the founder and CEO of higheredpoints.com. We allow students and families to convert loyalty points into tuition payments and for student loan repayments. So Higher Ed Points was an idea that was 20 years in the making. It was based on my career path. I spent the first part of my career in college textbook sales. And so I was on campuses selling textbooks, marketing textbooks, and then acquiring textbooks. And I loved the campus environment. So I understood the ins and outs of the university and college system in Canada that helped me understand how the administrative parts of our higher education system work. And then I worked at Air Miles in the loyalty industry, and actually in that role, in my business development role, tried to bring 3 university campuses into the Air Miles program so that students could earn points on their buying their textbooks and then burn them to help them pay for tuition. But unfortunately, I went on mat leave during my tenure in the loyalty industry, and nobody understood the higher ed space, so they couldn't navigate the administrative end of the university. So that sort of didn't work then. And then I ran a company that matched students with scholarships. So in that role, I kept meeting students that said, my parents make too much money, my marks aren't high enough, I need to find other sources of funding. And so after I left the scholarship matching company, people would say, what are you going to do now? And I said, I've always had this idea that converting loyalty points into paying for tuition would be a great thing. And every time I mentioned that to somebody, they knew somebody who knew somebody. So in 2013, Aeroplan came on board as our first loyalty partner. And Higher Ed Points had University of New Brunswick and Centennial College as our first two campuses on board with the program. And since 2013, we have over 135 universities and colleges and other educational institutions, and the Federal Student Loan Program, Canada Student Loans, and OSAP and Student Aid Alberta are in the program. So we actually can help the 1.3 million graduates repaying their student loans use their families, their bosses' loyalty points to help them repay their loans. So in 2013, the interesting thing about launching a business, and so Higher Ed Points is the first company in the world to convert loyalty points, existing loyalty points, directly into tuition payments and student loan repayments. There are programs that used to exist that let you accumulate them and then put them into RESPs. But the challenge with that model was it took too long for people to accumulate the points. So when I was talking about putting Higher Ed Points together, there are in North America $100 billion worth of loyalty points sitting in people's wallets. In Canada, there's $16 billion, and it's a renewable, free source of currency that anybody can tap into. And so I thought the difficult part was going to be getting a loyalty program on board, but Aeroplan was amazing. They came on board right at the beginning. They said, yes, we love this idea. And we love the fact that Higher Ed Points is the one that's going to be working with the universities and colleges because we don't have the resources. The universities and colleges loved it because they didn't have someone that could go and approach the loyalty program. So having Higher Ed Points as the hub was amazing, but it took a very long time to get the universities and colleges on board because they're relatively cautious and they wanted to make sure that this was something that was, beneficial to the students, that was reputable, that wasn't going to be, creating harm to the students and families. And so I think the biggest accomplishment over the 6 years that Higher Ed Points has been around is that the trust that we built with not just the universities and colleges, but the parents and the students. And a lot of people say, I can't believe this, because there's no fee for them to participate. They can tap into anybody's loyalty point. So a student, 96% of the people using the program are using somebody else's points. So students are using their parents' points. We have a student named Anthony whose aunt and uncle run a business, and they switched their credit card to a TD Rewards card, and through their business spend have helped him offset $17,000 of his OSAP loans. So the great thing about the program is that a student can find out about us, and then they can tap into their boss or their aunt or their parents or their aunts and uncles. We have one student who was able to pay off over $20,000 of his loans with his parents who used their corporate credit card. And what they did was they said, okay, we'll pay your loan, but you're going to pay us back 50 cents on the dollar. So he still had a responsibility to repay the loan to the parents, and they didn't pay any interest. So I think the thing that I'm trying with Higher Ed Points to help everybody understand is there are tons of sources of funding. So when we launched, the Canadian Federation of Students was at the conference we launched at, and they stood up and said, we don't like Higher Ed Points because it lets the government off the hook in making education free. The reality is the government can never make education free. There's not enough money in the coffers to make it absolutely free for every student. Even if tuition were free, how fair is it for the art student with the average tuition nationally is $6,000 to have free tuition, but then the med student or the business, the commerce student to have $28,000 of tuition free? There's no way to actually equalize that. So even if the first $6,000 of everybody's tuition were paid, you still have living expenses, transportation, books, ancillary materials on campus. So the reality is education will never be made free. And education debt is not bad debt. It's good debt because in the future, you're going to have a brighter future with an education. But what I would say to all students is make sure you're aware of all of the sources of funds out there. So my response to the Canadian Federation of Students when they said we don't like Higher Ed Points was, we know we're not the solution, but we're part of the solution. right? And so if families are already cobbling together 7 different sources of funds to pay for school, Higher Ed Points is one more source of that funding. And our average user is offsetting about $1,000 every time they come back to use the program in tuition. And $1,000, that's 100 hours of minimum wage work. So every dollar counts. Lots of research shows that by grade 5, age 11, students have self-selected themselves without any conversation with an adult about whether higher education is for them or not. And if there's any money set aside for a child for education, even as little as $750, that changes that student's attitude. And then the savings toward higher education is a very, it's a realistic thing for students to start doing in high school. So if they have a summer job, put away a portion of that money to pay for tuition. And also, a lot of students think that scholarships and awards are just for high achieving students. If you register it at websites like scholarshipscanada.com, they have tons of awards that aren't based on high marks or high achievement. Community service is important, but there are fun awards at Scholarships Canada listed like the Tall Person's Award. So any male over 6'1" and females over 5'10", I think it is, there's a scholarship. And Waterloo in particular has a scholarship for men over 6'5", because there was a grad from Waterloo who had to always have his dorm room accommodated for his height. So there's fun scholarships like that. So it's about doing the research to find them. But the thing that a lot of students don't do is they don't visit the on-campus financial aid department. And whenever I present to families and students, I say, on your campus visits, make sure that you're actually physically finding and going into the financial aid office. And a lot of campuses now have something called a One App. And so once a year, students can go in and register for the financial aid scholarships and bursaries. It's a registry essentially on a lot of campuses. And whenever new money comes into the system, they're automatically considered. So Ryerson had so much money left over from their endowed awards that they were able to go out to all the students who'd registered on their One App and say, what's the thing that you're struggling with the most? And for Ryerson, it's a commuter school. They found that it was TTC passes. So the Metro pass, and everybody who was registered was able to put their hand up and say, I need money for TTC. And they got $400 to pay for a TTC pass. So by registering in the financial aid office, you're actually eligible. All students, not just those on financial aid, are eligible for other awards and scholarships that come up over the course of the year. And then also look at, students often aren't thinking about how they're going to repay their loans until they graduate. If you can get anybody to use Higher Ed Points, we had a mom call in with a daughter who's studying. She's only in first year, but she wanted to use Higher Ed Points not to pay her tuition. She wanted it to repay the OSAP loans that she'd taken. So if you can start repaying those loans before you graduate, you're going to pay less interest. And over the life of a loan, the average, it takes 8 to 10 years for graduates to repay their government student loans. If you can reduce that, every $250 of loan that you can offset before you start paying interest over the life of that loan is going to save you $130 of interest. So imagine how much interest you can save. It's about $8,000 over the life of your loan if you can start repaying it earlier. So in the next month, I am so thrilled to report that Higher Ed Points will cross the $2 million threshold. So we will have offset $2 million of tuition and student loan repayments through the program. And that's over 345 million loyalty points that have been converted into tuition and student loans.
Not only do these cuts affect students directly, it also affects the schools themselves and what resources they have available through their funding. A new repercussion of the cuts is the introduction of something called the Student Choice Initiative. I sat down with Austin Pierce, who is the president-elect of the Alma Mater Society of Queens, to speak about this.
My name is Austin Pierce, and I am the president of the Alma Mater Society of Queen's University. So there's a lot of different ways that the cuts that this provincial government has made has impacted the AMS and students. Firstly, with the cuts to OSAP, a lot of students on our own campus have been impacted. That was announced on January 17th, along with the Student Choice Initiative. The Student Choice Initiative was a mandate from the provincial government that designated all fees that weren't deemed essential by the provincial government to be opt-outable, meaning that students now have the opportunity, based on what the provincial government says, to opt out of certain fees, services, and resources that otherwise would have been mandatory under the previous structures that the AMS had here at Queen's University. Yeah, so Student Choice Initiative was a mandate directed by Premier Doug Ford for the provincial government. it basically mandated that the provincial government, based on a set criteria, would determine what fees were deemed as mandatory and what fees were deemed as non-essential. They were labeled into 8 different categories. There were student awards and records, there was student cards, there was athletics and recreation, there were financial aid offices, there were health and wellness support, there was academic services as well, which all fees, if they were under those categories, would be deemed as mandatory, and all others that would fall out of that would be deemed as non-essential. So for the AMS, there was a lot of fees that didn't fit into those categories, such as all of the clubs, like the insurance that make sure that students don't get found liable for anything that happens when they're running an event. The AMS Food Bank, most of the awards and bursaries that the AMS gives to students for things like emergency taxi services or being able to attend a lot of the conferences or things that happen here on campus, all of those were deemed as optional and had a significant hit whenever the Student Choice Initiative rolled around, and students had the availability to opt out of those. Because the Student Choice Initiative was deemed unlawful by the courts, we're currently in a weird phase where the appeal, no one really knows where it's going to go. It can take years to go through, or alternatively, the provincial government, if this is something that they are seriously considering and they want to do, they might go ahead and legislate it. What that means is that if they go down that route, students are going to have to be vocal about what they think is essential. Here on our own campus at Queen's, we are one of the few organizations as the AMS that held referendums and had a democratic process that determined the price of fees, whether or not they were essential or mandatory. What students need to do on our own campus is say, it shouldn't be up to Doug Ford and the provincial government, it should be up to students as to determine what is essential on our own campus. Organizations like the AMS Food Bank, Sexual Assault Center Kingston, all of the bursaries, Accessibility Queens, all of them have been impacted negatively, and it's up to students to stand up and say, no, we can't have this. We think this is essential on our campus. We need this in order to get our education and attend a post-secondary institution like Queen's. That's what students need to do. And advocates, my successors in this role, me currently, everybody in the post-secondary sector who is in a leadership position has to stand up and say, no, it should be in the hands of students. It shouldn't be in the hands of the provincial government. The one thing is the Student Choice Initiative has had a significant impact on student lives. There are students often that come in who didn't read fee descriptions. They were very limited. We advocated really hard to have them longer. That makes students more informed. But unfortunately, some students opted out of things like Queen's Legal Aid, which meant that they no longer are able to receive legal aid services, which is also impacted considering there was cuts to Legal Aid Ontario from the same provincial government. So there are a lot of people who got themselves in tricky situations because of the mandate that the provincial government made on the Student Choice Initiative. Here in Kingston, there are a lot of risks that impact students' day-to-days. There's more and more financial responsibility with the cuts to OSAP. The housing crisis means that rents are going higher. There is food insecurity on our campus. All of that is impacted by the Student Choice Initiative because a lot of the services and advocacy portions of the AMS that went towards supporting those students either no longer exist or are in significant crisis and may no longer exist unless this changes. So the impact is real on not just student organizations, but the community as well as just students on our own campus. So the opt-out numbers really vary from organization to organization. For the AMS, for instance, as a whole, we have about 16% opt-out rate. For the Commerce Society, which does advocacy to the Smith School of Business, for instance, they had a higher one, almost 25%. Journalist programs across the province have been impacted negatively and put in crisis the ability of the free press to do their job. The Queen's Journal, for instance, had about a 25% opt-out rate. The numbers change a lot based on the organization or the group. The AMS Food Bank had a 21% opt-out rate, which impacts the services that we're able to offer, which is why the AMS is trying to do all we can to make sure that that is deemed mandatory for next year, because we can't have students going hungry. And we can't have people not being able to feed their family. The AMS Food Bank is a very accessible resource for a lot of people, and we have to ensure that that continues to exist, even in the era of Student Choice Initiative. The AMS is working hard to return to a lot of the democratic processes that Queen's students have relied on for decades. It shouldn't be the provincial government that says, no, this isn't essential to students at Queen's. It should be Queen's students that determine that, like they have for decades. The AMS is one of the most transparent organizations. We keep the university accountable when it comes to fees, and the students keep the university and the AMS accountable when it comes to those fees. And removing the democratic processes and the referendum processes, which the Student Choice Initiative essentially had done, would have created a lot of negativity on our campus and would have hurt a lot of people. So our hope is that the provincial government listens to everything that we say when we come to advocate on what these categories exist, if they determine to move forward with it, and if not, just make sure that everyone remains vigilant and fights for what they believe is necessary here in Kingston.
Post-secondary education through private institutions is an opportunity that not every Canadian has the means to attend, despite the fact that many students do want to attend schooling after high school. One of the biggest limitations that prevents young adults from attending post-secondary education is the financial demand of these institutions. History shows that students are more successful if some of the stress from financial demand is alleviated, whether it be through government intervention or through the work of alternative sources of income such as higher ed points or different forms of grants. The first step to reform and hopefully enable more students to attend post-secondary education, if they please, is awareness. This is an ongoing issue that evolves every day. Being aware of your situation and the financial situations of those around you will help you to be responsible with your vote and hopefully elicit the changes you want to see in your government and in your society. Don't be passive. We have to do all that we can now to help ourselves and future generations of students.